What if I told you that the most influential leader in human history used 3 specific psychological techniques that modern CEOs, politicians, and influencers have completely missed? Jesus of Nazareth didn't just change hearts through miracles. He mastered human psychology in ways that would make today's most sophisticated leaders look like amateurs. These weren't random acts of inspiration. They were calculated, strategic psychological maneuvers that turned 12 ordinary men into world changers and transformed an entire civilization. The truth is, these 3 psychological methods are hiding in plain sight, yet 99% of modern leaders have never recognized them. Today, we're going to decode the hidden psychology that built Christianity and discover why these ancient techniques still outperform every modern leadership strategy. If you're building anything, a business, a movement, or a legacy, the most powerful psychological weapons in history have been hidden for 2,000 years. What you're about to discover will change everything. Here's what everyone gets wrong about Jesus as a leader. They think his success came from divine power alone, completely missing the sophisticated psychological framework he deployed. Look at the facts. 12 working-class men, most of them fishermen and laborers, with 0 formal education, 0 political connections, and 0 resources, somehow built the largest movement in human history. This defies every modern understanding of leadership and influence. Modern experts will tell you that effective leadership requires extensive training, proven track records, substantial funding, and systematic approaches. Yet Jesus took men who had never led anything beyond fishing boats and turned them into leaders who would reshape civilizations. Peter, a volatile fisherman known for impulsive outbursts, became the rock upon which an entire church was built. Matthew, a despised tax collector, transformed into one of history's most influential writers. Thomas, famous for his skepticism, became a missionary who died spreading his message in India. The conventional explanation, divine intervention. But that explanation misses the genius of what was actually happening. Jesus wasn't just performing miracles, he was executing the most sophisticated psychological transformation program ever documented. He understood something about human psychology that modern leadership gurus have never grasped. True influence doesn't come from commanding authority or inspiring speeches. It comes from fundamentally rewiring how people see themselves and their potential. Every business school teaches leadership through external techniques: charisma, communication skills, strategic thinking. But Jesus operated from an entirely different playbook. He didn't just change what his followers did, he changed who they believed they were. And here's the most shocking part. His methods were so subtle, so elegantly disguised as simple teachings, that 2,000 years later, leadership experts still don't recognize the psychological mastery behind them. This wasn't accidental. This was strategic psychological warfare against limiting beliefs, societal expectations, and internal barriers that keep ordinary people from becoming extraordinary. The question isn't whether these techniques work. The evidence speaks for itself. The question is, why has no modern leader figured out how to replicate them? The first psychological technique Jesus mastered was what we now call identity architecture. The systematic reconstruction of self-perception through strategic narrative reframing. But he took it to a level that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. Watch how he operated. When Jesus first met Simon, he immediately renamed him Peter, meaning rock. This wasn't just a nickname, it was psychological programming. Simon was impulsive, unstable, prone to dramatic emotional swings, but Jesus began calling him Rock before Peter showed any evidence of stability. This created what psychologists now call future self-visualization, but with a twist that modern techniques miss entirely. Jesus didn't just give Peter a new name. He consistently treated him as if the transformation had already occurred. When Peter failed, and he failed spectacularly, denying Jesus 3 times during his crucifixion, Jesus didn't revoke the identity. Instead, he reinforced it. "Feed my sheep," he told Peter after the resurrection, assigning him the most crucial leadership role in the early church. This wasn't forgiveness, it was psychological architecture. The genius lies in understanding the difference between external motivation and identity transformation. Modern leaders try to motivate people by appealing to their current self-image. Jesus bypassed this entirely by implanting new identities and then creating experiences that would make those identities inevitable. Consider Matthew. Tax collectors were the most despised profession in Jewish society. Traitors who enriched themselves by collaborating with Roman oppressors. When Jesus called Matthew, he didn't try to rehabilitate his reputation or overcome social stigma. Instead, he immediately included Matthew in his inner circle and gave him the role of documenting their movement. Jesus transformed Matthew's greatest weakness, his attention to financial detail and record-keeping, into his greatest strength as a gospel writer. But here's where it gets psychologically sophisticated. Jesus understood that identity change requires three elements: new narrative, calling Simon Peter; consistent reinforcement, treating him as a rock even when he acted like sand; and experiential validation, giving him leadership opportunities that proved the identity true. Modern leadership development focuses on skills training and performance improvement. Jesus focused on identity installation. The results speak for themselves. These men didn't just follow Jesus. They became different people entirely. They didn't just learn his teachings. They embodied his principles so completely that they could replicate his influence without his physical presence. 2,000 years later, we're still studying their impact. This is why modern leadership development fails. It tries to modify behavior without transforming identity. Jesus understood that lasting change happens from the inside out, not the outside in. Think of identity like software running on the hardware of your brain. Most people are running outdated software, limited beliefs about what they're capable of, who they can become, what they deserve to achieve. Modern leadership training tries to teach new apps without upgrading the operating system. Jesus updated the entire OS. Here's the analogy that makes this crystal clear. Imagine you have a computer that keeps crashing because it's running Windows 95. But you keep trying to solve the problem by downloading newer apps. No matter how sophisticated the software, the old operating system can't handle it. That's what most leadership development does. It layers new techniques onto old identity systems. Jesus took a different approach. He didn't just give his followers new skills. He gave them completely new operating systems. Instead of trying to make fishermen better fishermen, he installed world-changer software. Instead of trying to make tax collectors more honest, he installed gospel writer programming. The psychological breakthrough was recognizing that people don't act based on what they know. They act based on who they believe they are. Change the identity, and the behavior changes automatically. Try to change behavior without changing identity, and people revert to their default programming the moment they face pressure. This is why Peter could walk on water when he believed Jesus saw him as someone capable of miracles, but sank the moment he doubted. The external conditions hadn't changed. The water was still water. The storm was still storming. What changed was Peter's momentary identity crisis. Modern leaders focus on external transformation, better strategies, improved skills, advanced techniques. Jesus focused on internal transformation, new identity, expanded self-concept, elevated beliefs about personal potential. The external changes followed naturally. This identity architecture wasn't just psychological manipulation, it was psychological liberation. Jesus freed people from the limiting beliefs that society had programmed into them and gave them permission to become who they were actually designed to be. He didn't create new people. He revealed the extraordinary potential that was already there, buried under layers of societal conditioning and self-doubt. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit subscribe. Because what comes next will blow your perspective on leadership, and if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide my next secrets from you. Here's the second psychological mystery that baffles modern leadership experts. Jesus consistently did the exact opposite of what every influence manual teaches, yet achieved unprecedented results. While today's leaders are taught to project strength, maintain authority, and demonstrate competence, Jesus routinely displayed vulnerability, served others, and admitted uncertainty. This should have destroyed his influence. Instead, it multiplied it exponentially. Consider the psychological paradox. The more powerful Jesus became, the more he deliberately positioned himself as powerless. At the height of his influence, when crowds were following him everywhere and religious leaders feared his impact, he washed his disciples' feet, a task reserved for the lowest servants. When people wanted to make him king, he retreated to pray alone. When his followers expected him to overthrow Rome, he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, not a war horse. Modern psychology calls this status inconsistency, and it typically destroys credibility. High-status individuals who engage in low-status behavior are usually seen as weak or confused. Yet Jesus' status inconsistency had the opposite effect. It made him more influential, not less. His followers didn't see weakness. They saw something completely unprecedented that they couldn't categorize or resist. The conventional wisdom in leadership development is clear: establish dominance, maintain superiority, project confidence. Alpha behavior creates followers. But Jesus operated from a completely different psychological framework that modern leaders have never decoded. He understood something about human psychology that contradicts everything we think we know about power and influence. Here's what makes this even more mysterious. His counterintuitive approach didn't just work with his immediate followers. It continued working for centuries after his death. The early Christians, facing persecution from the Roman Empire, could have chosen to fight back, establish military strength, or seek political power. Instead, they replicated Jesus' paradoxical approach, gaining influence through service, growing stronger through suffering, winning by losing. This defies every modern understanding of organizational behavior and social influence. Groups that embrace weakness should collapse. Movements that prioritize service over self-interest should fragment. Leaders who choose vulnerability over authority should lose followers. Yet the opposite happened. The more the early Christians embraced this paradoxical psychology, the faster their movement spread and the deeper their influence became. The question isn't just what Jesus was doing. It's how he understood human psychology so deeply that he could violate every rule of influence and still create the most powerful movement in history. The second psychological technique Jesus mastered was inverse authority, the strategic use of vulnerability and service to create unprecedented psychological influence. But this wasn't weakness disguised as strength. It was a completely different power structure that most leaders have never encountered. Here's the psychological breakthrough. Jesus understood that traditional authority creates compliance, not transformation. When someone commands you from a position of superiority, you obey to avoid consequences, not because you've been internally changed. The moment the authority figure leaves, the compliance disappears. But when someone serves you from a position of strength, it creates psychological debt and emotional connection that transcends physical presence. Watch how this operated in practice. When Jesus washed his disciples' feet, he wasn't just demonstrating humility, he was creating a psychological bond that traditional authority could never achieve. Peter's immediate reaction reveals the power dynamics at play. "You shall never wash my feet." Peter understood intuitively that this reversal of expected roles was psychologically overwhelming. It shattered every framework he had for understanding leadership and power. But Jesus pushed further. "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." This wasn't about cleanliness. It was about psychological transformation. By serving his followers in the most humble way possible, Jesus was communicating something that commands and speeches could never convey. Their worth to him was so profound that he would voluntarily lower himself to serve them. Modern neuroscience explains why this worked. When someone in a position of power serves us, it triggers what psychologists call reciprocal altruism and status elevation anxiety. We feel simultaneously grateful and guilty, grateful for the service, but anxious about the status inversion. This psychological tension can only be resolved by elevating our commitment to the person who served us. Jesus weaponized this psychological principle. Every act of service created psychological debt. Every moment of vulnerability generated emotional connection. Every display of humility established moral authority that traditional power structures couldn't match. His followers weren't just obeying orders, They were responding to someone who had invested in them personally. Consider the multiplication effect. When the disciples later led the early church, they replicated this approach. They didn't command through authority. They influenced through service. Paul, one of the most educated and influential leaders in the early church, consistently described himself as a slave to his communities. This wasn't false humility, it was strategic psychology. The genius of inverse authority is that it's nearly impossible to resist. When someone commands you, you can rebel. When someone serves you from a position of strength, rebellion feels like ingratitude. Traditional authority creates us versus them dynamics. Inverse authority creates partnership and mutual investment. This is why modern leadership development fails to create the deep influence that Jesus achieved. It focuses on establishing authority rather than earning influence. It teaches leaders to project strength rather than strategically deploy vulnerability. It prioritizes commanding respect rather than generating loyalty through service. Think of influence like a bank account. Traditional leaders make withdrawals. They demand respect, require obedience, expect service from others. Jesus made deposits. He served first, gave value first, invested in others first. When you consistently make deposits into people's emotional bank accounts, you build credit that allows you to make withdrawals later when you need them to follow you into difficult situations. Here's the analogy that crystallizes this principle. Imagine two generals preparing for battle. The first general stays in his tent, issues orders, and expects absolute obedience based on his rank. His soldiers comply because they have to, but their hearts aren't in the fight. The second general shares their food, carries wounded soldiers to safety, and fights alongside them in the trenches. When this general asks his soldiers to charge into danger, they don't just obey. They would follow him anywhere because he's already proven he values their lives more than his own comfort. Jesus was the second type of general. Every time he healed someone, fed the hungry, or comforted the grieving, he was making deposits in the influence bank account. When he later asked his followers to sacrifice everything for the movement, they didn't see it as a demand from authority. They saw it as a request from someone who had already sacrificed for them. The psychological power is in the sequence. Serve first, lead second. Most leaders try to establish leadership first, then expect service from others. This creates resistance because people feel used. Jesus flipped the script. He served first, which eliminated resistance and created volunteers instead of conscripts. Modern leaders miss this because they're taught to protect their status and maintain authority. But status protection creates psychological distance. Authority maintenance generates compliance, not commitment. Jesus understood that true influence comes from making others feel valuable, not from making yourself appear superior. This is why his movement survived his death and continues thriving 2,000 years later. He didn't create followers who depended on his presence. He created leaders who were psychologically equipped to reproduce his influence in his absence. They had experienced being served by greatness, so they knew how to serve others into greatness. The transformation was complete. People who had been served by Jesus couldn't help but serve others the same way. It became their identity, not just their behavior. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Hit like now and subscribe, because people like you deserve to know all the secrets I'll reveal in upcoming videos. Here's the third and most sophisticated psychological mystery. Jesus mastered what modern experts call paradoxical intervention, using apparent failure, suffering, and defeat as tools for ultimate victory. This defies every principle of success psychology, achievement motivation, and leadership resilience. Yet it became the foundation of the most influential movement in human history. Consider the psychological impossibility of what happened. At the moment of Jesus' greatest apparent defeat, crucified like a common criminal, abandoned by his followers, mocked by enemies, his influence should have evaporated. In every documented case throughout history, when a leader dies in disgrace, their movement collapses. Followers scatter, enemies celebrate, and the cause dies with the leader. Instead, the opposite occurred. Jesus' death transformed him from a regional teacher into a global phenomenon. His crucifixion, which should have been evidence of failure, became the central symbol of the largest religion on earth. The very thing that should have destroyed his credibility became the source of his ultimate authority. This violates every psychological principle we understand about influence and leadership. Success builds credibility. Victory attracts followers. Triumph demonstrates competence. But Jesus built his entire movement on the foundation of apparent defeat. And it worked better than any success-based approach ever has. Modern psychology has no framework for explaining this phenomenon. Cognitive dissonance theory suggests that when reality contradicts expectations, people reject the contradictory information to maintain their existing beliefs. When Jesus died, his followers should have concluded they had followed the wrong leader and returned to their previous lives. Instead, they did something unprecedented. They reinterpreted defeat as victory and weakness as strength. They proclaimed that losing was actually winning, that death was actually life, that failure was actually success. And somehow, this psychologically impossible narrative became the most compelling story ever told. Here's what makes this even more mysterious. This paradoxical psychology continued working for centuries. Early Christians faced persecution, torture, and death, yet grew stronger with every setback. Roman emperors tried to eliminate Christianity through systematic oppression, yet the more they attacked it, the faster it spread. Every attempt to destroy the movement only validated its central premise that victory comes through apparent defeat. The conventional wisdom in modern leadership development emphasizes avoiding failure, minimizing setbacks, and projecting success. Resilience is taught as the ability to recover from defeat and get back to winning. But Jesus operated from a completely different paradigm that turned defeat itself into victory. The third psychological technique Jesus mastered was transformative reframing. The ability to redefine reality in ways that turned every apparent disadvantage into ultimate advantage. This wasn't positive thinking or motivational speaking. It was systematic psychological restructuring that created entirely new categories of understanding. Here's the breakthrough. Jesus understood that most human suffering comes from fighting reality instead of reframing it. People resist pain, reject setbacks, and avoid failure because they've been programmed to see these experiences as purely negative. But Jesus created a psychological framework that transformed suffering from meaningless pain into meaningful purpose. The cross demonstrates this principle at its highest level. Crucifixion was designed by Romans to be the ultimate humiliation, a public display of powerlessness intended to destroy credibility and discourage resistance. It was psychological warfare through physical torture. But Jesus reframed the entire experience, transforming the ultimate symbol of defeat into the ultimate symbol of victory. The psychological genius was in the timing and the narrative structure. Jesus didn't just accept suffering. He predicted it, explained its purpose, and positioned it as necessary for a greater outcome. This created what psychologists now call post-traumatic growth. The phenomenon where people become stronger through difficulty rather than despite it. Watch how he prepared his followers. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. He wasn't promising to eliminate suffering. He was reframing it as evidence of victory rather than defeat. Every persecution became proof that they were following the right path. Every setback became validation that they were threatening the status quo. Every attack became confirmation that their message was powerful enough to worry their enemies. Modern neuroscience reveals why this reframing was so psychologically powerful. When we experience hardship within a meaningful framework, the brain processes it completely differently than when we see it as random suffering. Meaningful suffering activates resilience, purpose, and growth. Meaningless suffering activates despair, victimization, and collapse. Jesus gave his followers the psychological tools to find meaning in any circumstance. When they were arrested, it meant their message was being heard. When they were persecuted, it meant they were following his example. When they died for their beliefs, it meant they were graduating to ultimate victory. There was literally no experience that couldn't be reframed as confirmation of their purpose. This created psychological anti-fragility. They didn't just survive setbacks. They became stronger because of them. Every attack proved their importance. Every rejection validated their message. Every failure demonstrated their faithfulness. The movement became literally unstoppable because there was no form of opposition that couldn't be transformed into fuel for growth. The transformative reframing extended beyond crisis management to daily life. Poverty became spiritual wealth. Weakness became strength. Last became first. The entire value system was inverted, creating a parallel reality where conventional measures of success became irrelevant. This is why Christianity survived while other movements collapsed. Most leaders teach followers to avoid suffering, seek comfort, and pursue success. Jesus taught his followers to find purpose in suffering, strength in service, and victory in apparent defeat. Think of reality like a movie you're watching. Most people are passive viewers. When bad things happen on screen, they feel upset. When good things happen, they feel happy. Their emotional state is completely dependent on external circumstances. Jesus taught his followers to become directors instead of viewers, to control the meaning of every scene, regardless of what was actually happening. Here's the ultimate analogy. Imagine you're playing a video game where the objective isn't to avoid obstacles, but to transform every obstacle into a power-up. In most games, hitting a wall means failure. In this game, hitting a wall unlocks new abilities. Getting attacked by enemies doesn't decrease your health. It increases your experience points. Losing a battle doesn't mean game over, it means leveling up. Jesus created a psychological operating system where literally every experience could be processed as advancement toward the ultimate objective. Pain became character development. Rejection became validation. Death became graduation. There was no experience that couldn't be transformed into forward progress. The psychological breakthrough was recognizing that meaning is always assigned, never inherent. Two people can experience identical circumstances, but have completely different psychological responses based on the meaning they assign to what's happening. Jesus gave his followers a meaning-making framework that was literally undefeatable, because it transformed every possible experience into confirmation of their ultimate victory. Modern leaders try to control external circumstances to create positive experiences for their followers. Jesus taught his followers to control internal interpretation so that any external circumstance could become a positive experience. This made his movement psychologically invincible. The result was followers who were genuinely excited about difficulties because they had been trained to see every challenge as evidence of their importance and every setback as set up for greater impact. They weren't just resilient, they were anti-fragile. They grew stronger under pressure because pressure had been reframed as the mechanism for growth. This psychological framework spread because it worked. People who applied these principles didn't just survive difficult circumstances, they thrived in them. They became living proof that there was a different way to process reality that led to greater peace, purpose, and power than conventional approaches. 2,000 years later, we're still trying to figure out how he did it. These three psychological techniques, identity architecture, inverse authority, and transformative reframing, created the most powerful leadership system in history. Jesus didn't just change what people did, he changed who they believed they were, how they understood influence, and what they saw as possible. Modern leaders focus on external techniques while missing the internal transformation that makes lasting change inevitable. The man who turned fishermen into world changers understood human psychology at a level we're still trying to decode. His methods weren't just about building a movement. They were about unleashing human potential in ways that conventional leadership never achieves. If these secrets exploded your mind, you need to see my next videos. But only if you hit that notification bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful secrets in history. What's your opinion on these ideas? Leave it in the comments. Send this to that friend who has sharp perception. This analysis is speculative and based on publicly available historical accounts, not clinical diagnosis.